The day my father called my sister a hero, he had no idea the woman who trained America's rescue elite was standing 10 feet away. The first thing I noticed wasn't the applause. It was the patch. 100 conversations drifted through the ballroom of the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs, while crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished marble floors. Veterans, donors, politicians, and military families moved between decorated tables covered in white linen and blue Air Force banners. A jazz quartet played softly near the stage. Waiters carried trays of champagne and expensive appetizers through the crowd. Everyone looked polished. Everyone looked important. And right in the center of it all stood my younger sister, Madison Brooks, smiling as if the entire evening had been created for her alone. Maybe in her mind it had. Every time she turned toward a new group of guests, the Combat Rescue Qualification patch sewn neatly onto her formal Air Force uniform caught the light. People noticed it immediately. They always did. It was designed that way. Symbols of sacrifice tend to attract attention. The problem was that I knew exactly what that patch represented. More importantly, I knew exactly who had earned it and who hadn't. Across the room, my father was already halfway through another speech. Robert Brooks had always loved an audience. At 63 years old, he still carried himself like a man running for office, despite never having held one. He stood beside Madison with one hand proudly resting on her shoulder as a small circle of guests listened. "My daughter is one of the finest rescue specialists in the Air Force," he announced. Several people nodded with admiration. Someone raised a glass. Madison lowered her eyes modestly for about 2 seconds before accepting the praise she had spent most of her life chasing. "She completed one of the toughest programs in the military," my father continued. "Most people couldn't survive a week." More impressed reactions followed. I stood alone near the edge of the ballroom holding a glass of sparkling water. Nobody had introduced me to anyone. Nobody had asked what I did. Nobody seemed particularly interested that I had spent nearly 20 years in the Air Force myself. That wasn't unusual. It had been happening my entire life. Madison was the star. I was the background scenery. A woman wearing a donor badge approached me with a friendly smile. "And are you in the military too?" she asked. Before I could answer, Madison answered for me from 15 feet away. "Oh, Amelia does training administration." She laughed lightly. "Mostly paperwork and evaluations." A few guests smiled politely. My father chuckled. "Somebody has to handle the forms." More laughter followed. The woman looked embarrassed for me. I wasn't. "You can't be embarrassed by a story you've heard your entire life." "Something like that," I said. The conversation ended there. The woman drifted away. Across the ballroom, Madison immediately became the center of attention again. I took a sip of water and watched her. Not with jealousy, not with resentment, with recognition. There is a difference. Most people saw a decorated Air Force rescue specialist. I saw a candidate standing ankle-deep in freezing mud 5 years earlier. Most people saw courage. I remembered excuses. Most people saw achievement. I remembered a training file stamped failure twice in bright red letters. The memories arrived so clearly that for a moment I could almost smell the wet pine forests outside Fairchild Air Force Base, where advanced rescue selection took place. I remembered candidates carrying heavy rescue equipment through mountain terrain, in temperatures cold enough to make breathing painful. I remembered exhaustion. I remembered determination. I remembered watching people discover who they really were when nobody was applauding. That's where character lives, not on stages, not under spotlights, not during ceremonies. Character lives in the moments nobody wants to endure. Madison had never understood that. My father certainly hadn't. Another burst of applause pulled me back to the present. Robert had gathered a larger audience now. He loved doing that. "When Madison was a little girl," he announced proudly, "she was already tougher than most boys." A few people laughed. I always knew she'd do something extraordinary. I almost smiled at that. Growing up, my father had never missed an opportunity to praise Madison. When she won a school competition, the family celebrated for a week. When she made varsity athletics, relatives heard about it for months. When she enlisted in the Air Force, my father treated it like a presidential inauguration. Meanwhile, my own accomplishments seemed to disappear into the background. Graduating near the top of my class, becoming a rescue instructor, leading evaluation teams, training personnel who would later save American pilots in combat zones. None of it generated much interest. My father preferred stories he could easily explain at dinner parties, Madison made those stories easier. I made them complicated. The funny thing is that I stopped caring years ago. At least I thought I had. A server offered me champagne. I declined. Another donor approached my father. More introductions followed. More praise. More stories. The evening continued exactly as expected until I heard Madison begin describing her supposed rescue training experience. That got my attention immediately. The mountain phase was brutal, she told a group of guests. 3 straight days without sleep. Not true. The sleep deprivation period lasted 36 hours, not 72. A small mistake. Most people wouldn't notice. I did. Then we had to conduct casualty extractions during a blizzard, she continued. Again, not true. There hadn't been any blizzard during her class cycle. One of the guests looked fascinated. How did you get through it? Madison smiled confidently. You just refused to quit. I nearly laughed into my water. Refused to quit. The irony was almost impressive. Across the room, I noticed a retired Air Force colonel listening carefully. His expression changed slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me. Military professionals develop instincts. We recognize when a story sounds rehearsed instead of remembered. Madison kept talking. The instructors were relentless, she said dramatically. Especially the chief evaluator. My attention sharpened. Here we go. Nobody even knew her real name, Madison continued. She was basically a legend. Several guests leaned closer. People were terrified of her. The colonel raised an eyebrow. I stared into my glass. This was becoming dangerous. Not because of the lies. Because of how many lies were stacking on top of each other. Eventually, weight collapses any structure, even fictional ones. She tried to eliminate half the class, Madison said. Completely false. But I refused to let her beat me. More falsehoods. By the end, she actually told me I was one of the strongest candidates she'd ever seen. That one nearly made me choke. 5 years earlier, I had indeed spoken to Madison during her evaluation. The conversation had gone very differently. I remembered the rain. I remembered the darkness. I remembered her sitting on a wet log after voluntarily withdrawing from a mountain extraction exercise. Her exact words still lived in my memory. I can't do this anymore. Not because of injury. Not because of medical limitations. Because she didn't want to continue. People fail difficult training all the time. There is no shame in that. The shame comes from rewriting the story afterward. The applause grew louder. Madison smiled. My father looked proud enough to burst. And standing there near the edge of the ballroom, watching another fictional version of history become family truth, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not frustration, concern. Because this wasn't just exaggeration anymore. This was becoming identity. Madison had started believing her own mythology. That never ends well. As the evening continued, guests kept drifting toward her table. Questions came, compliments followed, stories grew larger, achievements became more dramatic, heroics became more impressive. Every retelling moved a little farther from reality. Then something happened that changed everything. A 4-star Air Force general entered the ballroom. Conversations immediately shifted. Heads turned, cameras appeared. The atmosphere changed. Most people saw a distinguished military leader arriving at a charity event. I saw something else entirely. I saw a man who knew exactly who I was, and as his eyes moved across the room, stopped directly on me, and widened in recognition, I realized this evening was about to become far more complicated than anyone including Madison could possibly imagine. The 4-star general entered the ballroom with the kind of quiet authority that made conversations slow without anyone being asked to stop. People noticed immediately. Military officers straightened instinctively. Donors turned their heads. Cameras appeared from nowhere. Within seconds, the center of attention began shifting away from Madison for the first time all evening. I watched from across the room as General Victor Langley exchanged handshakes with event organizers near the entrance. His distinguished service ribbon rack caught the chandelier light as he moved through the crowd. Most guests saw a decorated senior officer. I saw someone I had worked with 3 years earlier during a joint rescue readiness evaluation in Nevada. More importantly, he knew exactly who I was. For a brief moment, his eyes swept across the ballroom. Then they stopped on me. His expression changed instantly. Recognition. Not the polite recognition people use when they're trying to remember where they've met someone. Genuine recognition. The kind that comes from shared professional history. I saw him begin moving in my direction before another group intercepted him for photographs. Across the room, Madison was too busy enjoying her audience to notice. My father certainly didn't notice. Robert Brooks was already launching into another speech. "The military needs more people like Madison," he announced proudly to a cluster of donors and retired officers. "People willing to put everything on the line." Several people nodded politely. Madison smiled and lowered her head modestly. The performance was becoming familiar. What bothered me wasn't the attention. It was the patch. Every time I looked at it, another memory surfaced, another detail, another contradiction. 5 years earlier, during her second attempt at rescue selection, Madison had actually shown potential. More potential than most candidates. She was physically gifted, strong, fast, intelligent. That's what made everything more frustrating. Failure hadn't come from lack of ability. It came from something far more difficult to fix. She wanted recognition more than growth. During the first week of training, candidates were required to perform a series of mountain casualty extractions. Most people imagined dramatic helicopter rescues. The reality was less glamorous. Exhaustion, pain, cold weather, heavy equipment, endless repetition. We weren't evaluating heroics. We were evaluating reliability. When someone's life depends on you, reliability matters more than confidence. Madison never understood that distinction. She excelled whenever people were watching. The moment nobody was watching, her motivation changed. The memory drifted through my mind as another guest approached her. "Madison, is it true you completed Advanced Combat Rescue Qualification?" the man asked. Madison smiled immediately. "Yes, sir." The lie came so naturally it almost sounded rehearsed. "One of the hardest things I've ever done." I watched her continue the story. Every sentence added another layer. Every answer moved further away from reality. The strange thing was that nobody challenged her. Most people couldn't. They lacked the technical knowledge. Military qualifications often sound impressive because few civilians understand the details behind them. That's why symbols carry so much power. People see a patch and assume the story behind it is true. Across the ballroom, General Langley finally escaped another conversation and started moving toward me again. Before he could arrive, a retired colonel stepped into Madison's circle. I recognized him immediately. Colonel Richard Harlan, Rescue Community, 30 years of operational experience. Unlike most guests, he understood the profession. That made him dangerous. "Combat rescue qualification?" Harlan asked with interest. Madison nodded confidently. "That's right." "Which training group?" he asked casually. The smile on Madison's face hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Most people missed it. I didn't." "Fairchild," she answered. At least that part was correct. Harlan nodded. "Interesting." He took a sip of his drink. "What was your favorite phase?" Another tiny hesitation. "Mountain operations," Madison answered. "Definitely mountain operations." Harlan smiled politely. "Really?" Something about his tone caught my attention. Most graduates usually say water confidence. Madison laughed lightly. "Well, everybody's different. Technically true, but not a real answer," Harlan noticed. His expression remained pleasant. His eyes became sharper. The conversation continued. Small questions, simple questions, professional questions. Nothing aggressive, nothing confrontational. Yet with every answer, Madison seemed slightly less comfortable. It reminded me of watching a structure develop tiny cracks under pressure. Not enough to collapse. Not yet. Across the ballroom, my father noticed none of it. He was too busy enjoying the spotlight. "Madison has always been exceptional," he said proudly. Even as a child, I looked away. I'd heard variations of that speech for decades. What made it difficult wasn't the favoritism itself. It was how completely my father believed his own version of reality. In his mind, Madison truly was the extraordinary daughter while I was simply dependable, useful, reliable, ordinary. He didn't know about the rescue teams I'd trained. He didn't know about pilots who were alive because of procedures I'd helped develop. He didn't know that many of the people he admired professionally would recognize my name long before they recognized Madison's. The truth wasn't hidden because I was ashamed of it. The truth was hidden because nobody ever bothered asking. A sudden burst of laughter pulled my attention back to Madison's group. She was telling another story now. "There was this one extraction exercise," she said dramatically. "The instructors thought half the class would quit. More fiction. We carried casualties through freezing temperatures for 16 straight hours. More fiction. Most candidates broke. Fiction again. I just refused to stop. That part almost made me laugh. During her second selection attempt, Madison had voluntarily withdrawn from a mountain carry event after less than 6 hours. I remembered the exact weather conditions. I remembered the exact location. Most of all, I remembered the conversation afterward. "This isn't worth it," she had told an evaluator. Not because she couldn't continue, because she didn't want to. People often misunderstand elite military training. The goal isn't to identify the strongest people. It's to identify people who continue performing when they no longer feel strong. That's a completely different skill. General Langley finally reached me. "Captain Brooks." His voice carried enough authority that several nearby conversations paused immediately. I turned and smiled. "General." He shook my hand firmly. "Good to see you again." Several heads turned. A few guests looked surprised. General officers don't usually seek out training instructors at fundraising events. Langley glanced around the ballroom. "Still saving rescue programs from bad habits?" I laughed quietly. "Trying." He smiled. "The Air Force owes you more than a few favors." The comment wasn't dramatic. It wasn't intended for an audience. Unfortunately, audiences have a way of appearing whenever important people start talking. Nearby guests immediately became interested. I noticed Madison looking in our direction. So did my father. Confusion appeared on Robert's face. For perhaps the first time all evening, he looked uncertain. "General," I said carefully, hoping to redirect the conversation. "How have you been?" Fortunately, Langley understood social dynamics. Unfortunately, he also enjoyed honesty. "Busy," he answered. "Though every time I visit a rescue wing, somebody mentions the standards review team you built." More people were listening now. Madison's smile had disappeared. Not entirely, just enough for me to notice. The spotlight was moving. She could feel it. People like Madison always could. Langley continued talking about readiness evaluations, training standards, and operational improvements. Nothing classified, nothing dramatic. Yet every sentence created a subtle problem for the story my family had believed for years. Because the more he spoke, the harder it became to view me as the quiet, administrative sister who handled paperwork. Across the ballroom, I saw my father watching carefully. He wasn't shocked yet. He was curious. That was new. Curiosity eventually leads to questions. Questions eventually lead to answers. And answers have a way of changing entire evenings. Meanwhile, Colonel Harlan had resumed talking with Madison. The questions were becoming more specific now. Technical details. Operational terminology. Procedures. Small things. The kind of details graduates remember because they lived them. I watched Madison answer. I watched the uncertainty growing behind her eyes. I watched Harlan noticing every hesitation. Then he asked one simple question that made her freeze completely. "Who was your chief evaluator?" he said casually. For a second, the ballroom seemed quieter. Madison opened her mouth. Nothing came out. 5 years earlier, she hadn't known my identity. Candidates never did. But the truth was standing less than 30 feet away. And for the first time all evening, I had the distinct feeling that someone besides me was getting dangerously close to discovering it. For a few seconds, Madison simply stared at Colonel Harlan, as if the answer might somehow appear if she waited long enough. The problem with professional questions is that people who genuinely belong to a community rarely need time to answer them. Their memories arrive automatically because those experiences shaped them. People who borrow experiences from someone else's story usually need a moment to build the answer. Unfortunately for Madison, everyone in the rescue community understood the difference. Colonel Harlan's expression remained polite. He wasn't trying to embarrass her. He was simply asking the kind of question one rescue professional asks another. "Your chief evaluator," he repeated calmly. "Who was it?" Madison forced a small smile. "Honestly, it's been a while." Harlan nodded. "Sure." His tone remained friendly. "But people usually remember the evaluator who determines whether they graduate." Around them, several guests continued chatting, unaware of the tension beginning to form beneath the conversation. Others had started paying attention. General Langley remained beside me, discussing training standards with a retired Air Force commander, but I could tell he was listening too. Military people always listen when technical conversations become uncomfortable. Madison laughed lightly and took a sip of champagne. "There were so many instructors," she said. "I can't remember all their names." Harlan's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Interesting." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The silence did the work for him. Across the ballroom, my father noticed the exchange and immediately stepped closer. Robert Brooks had spent his entire life rescuing Madison from uncomfortable situations. "She's being modest," he said with a chuckle. "Always has been." Madison smiled gratefully. Harlan returned the smile politely. "Of course." Then he glanced toward me. That was the moment everything shifted another inch. Not dramatically, just enough. "Captain Brooks," he said, "you spent time in rescue training, didn't you?" Several nearby conversations slowed. I already knew where this was going. "A little," I answered. The understatement earned a laugh from General Langley. "A little?" he repeated. "That's one way to describe it." More heads turned. My father looked confused again. He clearly didn't understand why a 4-star general found my answer amusing. Harlan smiled. "How many candidates have you evaluated over the years?" I thought about it. Probably around 2,000. That got a reaction. Even guests who knew nothing about military training understood that 2,000 was not a small number. Madison's posture stiffened. My father blinked twice. 2,000? He repeated. "I thought you handled training administration." The question hung in the air. I looked at him for a moment, then I shrugged. "Training involves a lot of things." Langley nearly laughed again. "That's also one way to describe it." A retired Chief Master Sergeant standing nearby shook his head. "Captain Brooks is being modest." He looked toward one of the donors. "Her evaluation standards are used across multiple rescue units." That statement attracted even more attention. I could practically feel Madison's discomfort growing. The spotlight wasn't supposed to be moving toward me. It certainly wasn't supposed to stay there. For most of our lives, family gatherings had followed a predictable pattern. Madison received admiration. I received polite acknowledgement. Nobody asked questions. Nobody looked deeper. Tonight was becoming something different. "So what exactly do you do?" one donor finally asked. Before I could answer, General Langley answered for me. "She helps determine who is qualified to rescue American service members in combat." Silence followed. Not dramatic silence, curious silence. The kind that appears when people realize they may have misunderstood someone. I saw my father's expression change again. Confusion was giving way to uncertainty. Uncertainty was giving way to curiosity. That process usually takes years. Tonight it was happening in minutes. Madison immediately tried to regain control of the conversation. "Well, training is important," she said quickly. "But operational experience is different." The statement sounded harmless enough. Unfortunately, she had chosen the wrong audience. "True," Langley replied casually. "How many deployments have you completed?" Madison froze. The question wasn't hostile. It was normal military conversation. Yet I could almost hear her calculating possible answers. "Several," she finally said. Langley waited. "Where?" Another pause. A dangerous pause. "Mostly support assignments. Technically vague. Technically meaningless." Langley nodded politely. Then he looked at me. "And you?" I sighed internally. "A few overseas rotations." "Afghanistan?" he asked. "Yes." "Syria?" "Yes." "Djibouti?" "Yes." "Pacific Rescue Detachments?" "A couple." Every answer seemed to make Madison smaller. I wasn't trying to compete with her. I wasn't trying to expose her. I was simply answering questions. Sometimes the truth creates problems all by itself. Across the ballroom, the charity event continued. Waiters moved between tables. A live auction was being prepared near the stage. Guests laughed and socialized. Yet within our corner of the room, something entirely different was happening. People were beginning to compare stories. More importantly, they were beginning to compare credibility. Madison sensed it too. That's why she changed tactics. "The real heroes are the operators," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "The people doing the actual rescues." A few guests nodded. It sounded humble. It sounded admirable. Unfortunately, it wasn't really humility. It was an attempt to reposition herself as the more experienced professional. Harlan noticed immediately. "Which rescue operation was the most challenging for you?" he asked. Madison blinked. "There were a lot of them, I'm sure." Harlan smiled. "Pick one. The trap wasn't intentional. That's what made it effective." Professionals usually enjoy talking about experiences they've actually lived. Madison didn't. She offered a vague story involving mountain extraction procedures. Within 30 seconds, the details started falling apart. Distances didn't make sense. Equipment descriptions didn't match. Terminology became inconsistent. Most civilians couldn't identify the problems. Military personnel could. I watched several veterans exchange subtle glances. Nobody challenged her directly. Nobody needed to. Credibility was eroding naturally. The strange thing was that I almost felt sorry for her. Not because she was being exposed. Because she had spent years creating a version of herself that couldn't survive basic questions. That kind of life must be exhausting. Harlan finally shifted his attention back toward me. "What made you choose rescue training?" he asked. The question surprised me. I thought about it for a second. Because somebody trained the people who saved my friend. The group became quiet. "Years ago," I continued, "a rescue team extracted one of my closest friends after a helicopter incident. He survived because highly trained people showed up and did their jobs correctly. Nobody interrupted. After that, I figured the best way to help was to make sure future rescue teams were ready." Langley nodded slowly. "And you've done that better than most." I looked away. Compliments always made me uncomfortable. My father looked stunned. Not because of the compliment itself. Because he was hearing information he should have known years earlier. Information he had never bothered asking about. Across the room, the auction host stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the fundraising portion of the evening. Guests began moving toward their assigned tables. The crowd around us slowly dispersed. For a moment, I thought the tension might finally disappear. Then Colonel Harlan said something that stopped me cold. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I still can't figure something out." Madison looked nervous immediately. "What's that?" Harlan smiled politely. "The details in your training stories don't match the curriculum from your class cycle." Complete silence. My father stared at him. Madison's face lost color. General Langley folded his arms. Harlan wasn't accusing anyone. He genuinely sounded confused. "That's strange," he continued. "Because I reviewed portions of that program myself." Madison opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time all evening, she looked frightened. Not embarrassed, frightened, because she finally understood what I had known since the moment I saw that patch on her uniform. The people asking questions weren't civilians anymore. They were professionals. And professionals eventually notice when reality doesn't match the story. As guests took their seats for the auction, I glanced toward the stage and noticed something unexpected. A large screen behind the podium had begun displaying highlights from the Air Force Rescue Foundation. Photographs appeared one after another. Training exercises, rescue operations, evaluation teams. Then suddenly an image flashed across the screen that made my stomach tighten. It was an old training photograph from 5 years earlier. A rescue evaluation team standing beside a mountain extraction course. Most guests wouldn't recognize anyone in the picture. I recognized every face instantly. And standing at the center of the image, partially obscured by equipment and weather gear, was me. More importantly, standing 30 feet behind me was Madison. The same training cycle she had spent the entire evening pretending to graduate from. The same training cycle she had failed. And as the image remained on the giant screen above the ballroom, I realized there was a very real chance that someone else was about to recognize it too. The photograph remained on the giant screen longer than I expected. It was only one image among dozens prepared for the Air Force Rescue Foundation presentation, yet it seemed to freeze the entire evening for me. Most people continued finding their seats and preparing for the auction. They saw a group of military personnel standing near a mountain training site. Nothing more. Military photographs all look similar to civilians. Uniforms, equipment, serious expressions, harsh weather. To them it was just another image. To me it was a record, a piece of history, evidence. The moment the photograph appeared, I instinctively looked toward Madison. Her reaction told me everything. The color drained from her face almost immediately. She recognized it too. 5 years had passed, but not enough time to erase that memory. She knew exactly where that picture had been taken. She knew exactly what happened during that training cycle. Most importantly, she knew she wasn't standing there as a graduate. She was standing there as a candidate who never completed the course. The image disappeared after only a few seconds, replaced by photographs of rescue helicopters and training exercises, but the damage had already been done. Colonel Harlan had noticed Madison's reaction. General Langley had noticed it too. Military professionals spend entire careers reading people under pressure. Fear leaves traces. Madison was leaving them everywhere. The charity host welcomed everyone to the formal portion of the evening and encouraged guests to begin bidding on auction items. Conversation shifted toward fundraising goals and foundation projects. For a little while, It seemed as if the earlier tension might dissolve into the background. I should have known better. People like Madison rarely walk away from a situation when they feel control slipping. They usually try to seize it back. 20 minutes later, the opportunity arrived. The auction featured several unique experiences donated by military organizations: flight simulator sessions, air museum tours, VIP access to training demonstrations. Then one item appeared that immediately caught everyone's attention. A local rescue wing had donated an exclusive invitation to observe a live combat rescue demonstration scheduled for the following morning. The event included helicopter operations, extraction procedures, casualty evacuation techniques, and rescue equipment displays. The room responded enthusiastically. Military-themed auctions always performed well at these fundraisers. The bidding escalated quickly. During the presentation, the host invited several military guests to briefly discuss the importance of rescue training. General Langley was one of them. Colonel Harlan was another. Unfortunately, Madison volunteered before anyone asked. "I've participated in exercises very similar to tomorrow's demonstration," she announced confidently from her table. Several nearby guests immediately turned toward her. There it was again, the spotlight. She couldn't resist it. "Actually," she continued, "many of the techniques you'll see tomorrow are things I used during qualification." The statement pulled more attention her way. My father smiled proudly. The old pattern was returning. At least that's what he thought. Across the room I saw Harlan studying her carefully. Not suspiciously, thoughtfully, like a man assembling a puzzle piece by piece. "Really?" he asked. "Then perhaps you can explain some of the procedures to our civilian guests." Madison smiled. "Of course." The trap wasn't obvious. That's what made it dangerous. Harlan wasn't trying to embarrass her. He was giving her an opportunity to demonstrate knowledge she claimed to possess. Real professionals usually welcome opportunities like that. Madison should have declined. Instead, she leaned forward eagerly. "Combat rescue is about making decisions under pressure," she began. The first few sentences sounded reasonable, generic, safe. Then she started adding details, technical details, specific procedures, equipment terminology. Every time she became more specific, the inaccuracies increased. I watched veterans exchange glances again. One retired pararescueman actually frowned. Madison kept talking. The audience kept listening. The farther she went, the worse it became. Finally, Harlan interrupted politely. "Interesting." He smiled. "Which extraction protocol are you referring to?" Madison hesitated. "Protocol 7. The answer landed badly. Not because civilians understood it. Because the rescue personnel in the room did. There was no Protocol 7. Not in the context she described. The retired pararescueman sitting near the stage actually looked down at his drink to hide a smile. General Langley folded his arms. My father noticed none of this. He simply saw military professionals listening to his daughter. That alone made him proud. "Perhaps things have changed since my time," Harlan said pleasantly. Madison nodded immediately. "Exactly." Another mistake. Harlan had retired only 3 years earlier. The procedure she described hadn't existed 5 years ago because it didn't exist now. A few veterans exchanged another look. Madison sensed something was wrong but couldn't identify what. That was the problem with borrowed expertise. You never know where the holes are. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, Madison made the mistake that changed everything. She looked directly at me. "Of course," she said with a smile that felt forced. "Most people here probably aren't interested in technical details." A few guests laughed politely. My sister definitely isn't. Amelia always preferred administration to field operations. There it was, the familiar dismissal, the old family narrative. Normally, I would have ignored it. Tonight felt different. Not because I wanted to defend myself, because too many people in the room already knew the truth. The statement sounded absurd now. Harlan looked genuinely confused. "Administration?" he repeated. Langley almost laughed. Again, Madison noticed. So did my father. "What?" Robert asked. Harlan turned toward him. "Your daughter oversees portions of rescue evaluation standards." Robert stared. "Amelia?" "Yes." "No. She handles training paperwork." This time even Langley couldn't hide his amusement. "Mr. Brooks," he said carefully. "The paperwork exists because people like Captain Brooks create the standards behind it." My father blinked several times. It was obvious he was hearing this information for the first time. The realization seemed to unsettle him. Across the table, Madison's frustration was becoming visible. The spotlight had escaped again. Worse, it was escaping because people were asking legitimate questions. Questions she couldn't answer. Questions I could. She needed another strategy. If Amelia knows so much, she said casually, maybe she should explain tomorrow's rescue demonstration. The challenge sounded playful. It wasn't. I recognized the tone immediately. She was trying to place me in an uncomfortable position. The problem was that she still didn't understand the position she was actually creating. Sure, I said. The answer surprised her. Tomorrow you'll probably see a helicopter insertion, casualty stabilization, extraction procedures, communications coordination, and equipment verification. The exact sequence depends on weather and operational objectives. Silence. Not because the explanation was impressive, because it was effortless. I hadn't performed. I hadn't thought. I simply answered. Harlan smiled slightly. Anything else? The most important part won't be visible, I said. Several guests looked interested. What's that? A donor asked. Decision-making. I shrugged. Anybody can learn equipment. The difficult part is making correct decisions when somebody's life depends on them. Complete silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Respectful silence. I recognized it because I'd experienced it before. It appears when people stop listening to words and start listening to experience. Madison recognized it too. Her expression tightened immediately. She could feel the difference. She could feel the audience changing. That's when she made the worst decision of the evening. She stood up, smiling, confident, desperate. Actually, she said, why don't we settle this tomorrow? Every head turned toward her. My stomach sank slightly. I already knew where this was heading. Settle what? Harlan asked. Madison folded her arms. If Amelia knows rescue operations so well, she should participate in the demonstration. The room became quiet. My father looked excited. The veterans looked interested. Langley looked concerned. I looked directly at Madison. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she smiled wider. Just a friendly demonstration. Friendly. The most dangerous word in family conflicts. People use it whenever they want to disguise competition as entertainment. My father laughed immediately. That's a great idea. Of course he thought so. He still believed the outcome was obvious. Madison clearly believed the same thing. The problem was that neither of them understood what tomorrow's demonstration actually involved. General Langley did. Colonel Harlan did. I did. Which was why none of us were smiling. What do you think, Captain? Harlan asked. The room waited. Madison waited. My father waited. For a brief moment I considered saying no. Then I remembered the photograph. The patch, the stories, the years of pretending. Finally, I set down my glass and looked directly at my sister. All right, I said. I'll do it. The confidence vanished from her face so quickly that almost nobody noticed. Almost nobody except me. Because for the first time all evening, Madison looked exactly like she had looked 5 years earlier on a mountain training course when she realized she had made a very serious mistake. I slept less than 3 hours that night. Not because I was nervous about the demonstration. I had participated in hundreds of rescue evaluations throughout my career. Demonstrations didn't bother me. What kept me awake was the look on Madison's face after I accepted her challenge. For the first time in years, I had seen genuine uncertainty behind her confidence. It reminded me of candidates standing at the edge of a mountain extraction course, right before they discovered whether their self-image matched reality. Most people spend their lives avoiding those moments. Reality can be uncomfortable. Unfortunately, reality was waiting for all of us the next morning. The Colorado sky was perfectly clear when I arrived at Peterson Space Force Base shortly after sunrise. The demonstration area had already been prepared. Rescue helicopters sat on the flight line. Ground crews moved equipment into position. Medical training stations had been established across a large section of the field. Visitors began arriving shortly afterward. Donors, veterans, military families, local officials. The fundraiser guests from the previous night quickly gathered near the viewing area. Everyone seemed excited. Most of them believed they were about to watch a simple military demonstration. A few knew something else was happening. Colonel Harlan knew. General Langley knew. I suspected several retired rescue operators knew as well. They had seen enough during the fundraiser to understand that the day was no longer just about helicopters and equipment. It had become a test of credibility. Madison arrived with my father nearly 30 minutes later. She looked confident again. At least on the surface. Her uniform was immaculate. Her rescue patch remained proudly displayed. My father looked energized. He treated the entire event like a sporting competition. "This should be fun," he said loudly as he approached. "Let's finally see who's the real expert." I glanced at him and almost smiled. He still didn't understand. The goal of rescue operations isn't showing off. It isn't winning. It isn't impressing people. The best rescue personnel I ever met hated attention. They focused on outcomes. Unfortunately, my father measured everything through an audience. Across the field, General Langley greeted several commanders before walking toward me. "You still have time to decline," he said quietly. "You know that's not happening." He laughed softly. I figured. Nearby, Harlan joined us. "This may become educational." "For who?" I asked. Harlan looked toward Madison. "We'll find out." The demonstration began shortly after 8 o'clock. A rescue squadron commander welcomed everyone and explained the purpose of combat rescue operations. Most civilians listened politely. Some seemed fascinated. Others were clearly more interested in the aircraft. The first exercise involved casualty stabilization, nothing dramatic. Medical assessment, treatment priorities, evacuation planning, basic rescue fundamentals. The instructors selected volunteers from the audience to participate. Madison immediately volunteered. Of course she did. The lead instructor smiled and welcomed her forward. "Excellent," he said. "Let's see how you assess this casualty." A role player lay on a training litter nearby. The scenario was simple. Simple enough that most trained rescue personnel could complete it half asleep. Madison approached confidently. The first few steps looked fine. Then small mistakes started appearing. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing obvious to civilians. Positioning errors. Assessment sequence errors. Communication errors. Tiny details. The sort of details professionals notice instantly. I watched several rescue operators exchange glances. The instructor remained polite. He corrected her twice, then a third time. By the end of the scenario, the confidence she had displayed at the fundraiser was noticeably weaker. My father didn't notice. Most civilians didn't either. They saw uniforms and equipment. Professionals saw performance. The next exercise involved rescue planning. Teams were given a simulated emergency and asked to explain how they would respond. Again, Madison volunteered. Again, things began well enough. Again, the problems appeared as soon as specifics entered the conversation. Rescue work isn't built on dramatic speeches. It's built on details, routes, resources, risks, timelines, communication plans. Every answer creates 3 new questions. Madison kept offering broad statements. The instructors kept asking for specifics. The gap between confidence and competence grew larger with every minute. Around noon, the demonstration shifted into its final phase. This was the portion everyone had been waiting for. A full rescue extraction simulation involving helicopters, ground teams, and casualty recovery procedures. The audience moved closer to the viewing area. Cameras appeared. Excitement spread through the crowd. The squadron commander explained that a volunteer would assist the rescue team during portions of the exercise. Before he could continue, my father raised his hand. Madison should do it. Several people laughed. Madison smiled and stepped forward. Then the commander looked directly at me. "Captain Brooks?" I already knew why. We'd worked together before. "Would you also participate?" "Of course." Madison's expression tightened slightly. The scenario began with a simulated aircraft crash in rough terrain. Rescue teams established a perimeter. Communications channels opened. Medical personnel prepared equipment. Everything unfolded exactly the way real operations begin. Organized, methodical, professional. The difference between movies and reality is that real professionals rarely look dramatic. They simply do their jobs. During the first phase, Madison was asked to assist with casualty prioritization. Within 2 minutes, she was struggling. Procedures she claimed to know during the fundraiser suddenly seemed unfamiliar. Terminology became uncertain. Decisions became hesitant. The instructors remained respectful. Nobody embarrassed her. Nobody needed to. The exercise itself was doing the work. Then came my turn. One of the team leaders handed me a radio and briefed me on the scenario. I nodded once. That's all. Years of repetition have a way of simplifying things. The crowd disappeared. The cameras disappeared. The audience disappeared. For a few minutes it felt like every real rescue evaluation I had ever supervised. Assess, prioritize, communicate, execute, nothing more. Nothing less. I moved through the scenario naturally. Not because I was trying to impress anyone. Because these procedures had become second nature long ago. Every decision flowed into the next. Every action had a purpose. The instructors stopped explaining things and started treating me like another member of the team. I barely noticed when the audience became quiet. Later, people told me the silence was remarkable. Hundreds of people standing behind the barriers without speaking, watching, learning, comparing. At one point, the rescue operations chief handed me a planning tablet and asked how I would modify the extraction sequence if weather conditions deteriorated. I answered immediately. Then another question came. Then another. Then another. The discussion became increasingly technical. I didn't think much about it. I simply responded. Across the field, I saw Harlan smiling. General Langley looked amused. Several retired operators had stopped watching the helicopter entirely. They were watching me. More specifically, they were watching the difference between experience and performance. By the end of the exercise, the contrast had become impossible to ignore. Nobody said it aloud. Nobody needed to. The crowd could see it. My father could see it. Madison could definitely see it. The rescue chief finally ended the demonstration and thanked everyone for participating. Applause erupted across the viewing area. People gathered around the helicopters. Conversations exploded everywhere. Yet one small group remained unusually quiet. My father, Madison, Harlan, Langley, me. The rescue chief walked directly toward us. "Captain Brooks," he said. "I haven't seen somebody handle that scenario that smoothly in years." Several nearby guests heard him. The chief continued. "You ever think about coming back to field evaluations?" Before I could answer, Harlan laughed softly. "Tell them what her nickname was." The rescue chief smiled immediately. "Ghost." My father's head turned toward me. "Ghost?" Harlan nodded. "Most candidates never saw her. They just feared being evaluated by her." More silence followed. The dangerous kind. The kind that appears when long-held assumptions start collapsing. Then the rescue chief asked a question that changed everything. He looked directly at Madison and said, "Wait a minute. Weren't you in Captain Brooks's evaluation cycle years ago?" The color disappeared from Madison's face. Completely. Around us, conversations seemed to fade. My father stared at her. Harlan stopped smiling. Langley folded his arms. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because for the first time since this entire story began, the truth had finally arrived at the edge of the conversation. And it was only one question away from becoming impossible to stop. The question seemed to hang in the Colorado air long after the rescue chief finished speaking. "Weren't you in Captain Brooks's evaluation cycle years ago?" Simple words. Ordinary words. Yet I watched the effect ripple through everyone standing nearby. My father looked from the chief to Madison, then from Madison to me. The confidence that had carried him through the fundraiser and the demonstration finally disappeared. For the first time in my life, Robert Brooks looked genuinely uncertain about which version of reality he was standing in. Madison opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. Around us, people continued talking about helicopters and rescue equipment, completely unaware that an entirely different kind of collision was taking place only a few feet away. Colonel Harlan remained silent. General Langley remained silent. They didn't need to speak. Professionals understand that facts are most powerful when allowed to stand on their own. The rescue chief frowned slightly. "I thought I recognized your name from an old candidate roster." Madison forced a weak smile. "There were a lot of candidates." "There were," the chief agreed. Then he looked at me. "Captain Brooks supervised that cycle, didn't she?" The silence became heavier. My father turned toward me slowly. "Supervised?" he asked. I could hear the confusion in his voice. What does he mean supervised? I considered giving a short answer. Unfortunately, there was no short answer left. Not anymore. "I was part of the evaluation team," I said calmly. The rescue chief laughed softly. "Part of it?" He shook his head. "Captain Brooks led a significant portion of the evaluation process." Several nearby rescue personnel nodded immediately. My father stared at me as if he were seeing someone unfamiliar. "You never told me that." The statement surprised me. Not because it was wrong, because it revealed something much deeper. "You never asked," I replied. Nobody said anything after that. There wasn't really anything to say. Across the years, I had completed deployments, advanced instructor assignments, operational evaluations, rescue readiness reviews, and training standard development projects. The information had never been hidden. My father simply never showed interest. Madison's achievements were easy to celebrate. Mine required questions. Questions had never been his specialty. The rescue chief looked back toward Madison. If you were in that cycle, then you probably remember Captain Brooks pretty well. Madison looked like she wanted to disappear. I recognized that expression. I'd seen it before. Candidates wore it when they realized excuses had stopped working. I remember, she said quietly. The chief smiled. Most people do. Then he glanced toward me. Ghost had a reputation. A few rescue operators laughed. My father blinked. Ghost? The chief nodded. Her call sign. More confusion appeared on Robert's face. Call sign? General Langley finally stepped in. Your daughter became one of the most respected rescue evaluators in the Air Force. He said it matter-of-factly, not dramatically. Somehow that made it more powerful. Many of the rescue specialists serving today passed through programs she helped design or supervise. The words landed harder than any speech could have. My father looked stunned, truly stunned. For years he had described me as the daughter who handled paperwork while Madison represented achievement. Now, senior military leaders were describing a completely different reality, one that had existed the entire time. The problem wasn't that he had been lied to. The problem was that he had never looked closely enough to notice. Madison lowered her eyes. The rescue chief studied her for a moment. Then he asked the question everyone else was avoiding. Did you ever complete the qualification program? Complete silence followed. Absolute silence. Even the wind seemed quieter. My father immediately looked toward Madison. So did several nearby guests. There it was. The question she had spent years avoiding. Not because it was complicated, because the answer was simple. Madison swallowed. I could see the struggle happening behind her eyes. She had reached the same crossroads candidates reached during difficult evaluations. Continue protecting the story or face the truth. For a long moment nobody moved. Then something unexpected happened. Madison exhaled slowly. The fight left her shoulders. No, she said. Her voice barely carried above a whisper. Nobody interrupted. I didn't. Another pause. I failed. The words seemed to physically hurt her. Twice. My father stared at her. What? Madison closed her eyes briefly. I failed the qualification course. Around us, conversations continued in the distance. Helicopters sat quietly on the flight line. Rescue teams packed equipment. Life moved forward while one carefully maintained illusion finally collapsed. Nobody mocked her. Nobody celebrated. Nobody looked triumphant. That's the funny thing about truth. Mature people rarely cheer when it arrives. They simply recognize it. My father looked devastated. Not because Madison had failed, because he suddenly realized how much he had misunderstood. Then the patch. Madison reached up slowly and touched the qualification patch on her uniform. For years it had represented the version of herself she wanted people to believe. I shouldn't have worn it, she admitted. I knew that. Tears appeared in her eyes. Her voice broke. I got tired of feeling like I wasn't enough. Those words changed everything. Suddenly this wasn't about patches, or qualifications, or family rivalry. It was about insecurity. The same insecurity that had driven her for years. The same insecurity that convinced her attention mattered more than growth. I looked at my younger sister and, for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel frustration. I felt sadness. Because beneath all the stories and exaggerations was someone who genuinely believed she needed to become somebody else to deserve respect. The irony was painful. She had never needed to become somebody else. She only needed to become herself. My father sat down heavily on a nearby bench. He looked older than he had 20 minutes earlier. I don't understand, he said quietly. How did I miss all of this? Nobody answered immediately. Then General Langley did. Because you were looking at recognition instead of contribution. Robert looked up. Langley continued. A lot of people make that mistake. The 4-star general glanced toward me. Some contributions are loud. Others save lives quietly for decades. My father followed his gaze. For a long moment he simply looked at me. Then something happened that I never expected. I'm sorry, Amelia. The words were simple, imperfect, human. I should have paid attention. The apology wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. There were no speeches, no tears, no grand public redemption. Just honesty. Real honesty. And somehow that mattered more. I nodded once. Thank you. That was enough. Across the field, the event organizers announced the final recognition ceremony. Guests began gathering near the main stage. We followed the crowd. A few minutes later, the foundation director stepped to the microphone and thanked everyone for supporting military rescue programs. Awards were presented. Donations were recognized. Then the director surprised me. Before we conclude, he said, there is one individual we would like to acknowledge. I immediately suspected trouble. General Langley smiled. Harlan smiled too, the director continued. Many of the rescue professionals honored today share one thing in common. At some point in their careers, they were evaluated, mentored, or trained by Captain Amelia Brooks. Hundreds of faces turned toward me. I froze. The director gestured toward the stage. Captain Brooks, would you join us? I hated public recognition. Always had. Yet there was no escape. As I walked toward the stage, something remarkable happened. Rescue personnel throughout the audience stood up, one after another. Operators, instructors, pilots, medical specialists, men and women I had trained, evaluated, or worked beside over the years. The standing ovation spread through the crowd until nearly everyone was on their feet. The applause wasn't loud at first. It grew gradually, authentically. Respect doesn't arrive all at once. It builds over time. Looking across that audience, I realized something important. None of those people were applauding because of a title. They weren't applauding because years of ordinary decisions made correctly. Years of choosing responsibility over recognition. As I accepted the award, my eyes briefly found my father in the crowd. Then Madison. Neither looked shocked anymore. They looked thoughtful. Maybe even proud. For the first time, it felt real. Not because they finally understood everything. Because they had finally started looking. Later that afternoon, as I walked toward my car beneath the clear Colorado sky, I thought about everything that had happened. The fundraiser. The lies. The demonstrations. The truth. In the end, nobody had destroyed Madison's reputation. Nobody had humiliated her. Nobody had sought revenge. The truth simply arrived. And once it arrived, everyone had a choice. Accept it or continue pretending. That's a choice all of us face sooner or later. Before you go, I'd like to leave you with a question. Have you ever spent so much time trying to look successful that you forgot to build the things that actually create success? If this story meant something to you, let me know in the comments. And if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or misunderstood, remember this: recognition may come late, or it may never come at all. But character is built the same way, regardless of who is watching. Sometimes the most important work you'll ever do happens in complete silence. And sometimes, years later, that quiet work speaks for itself.